Okay, so you know how we always end up talking about Freud?
Yeah.
Today's deep dive is going to be a little different. We're going to be looking at the work of Alfred Adler and Adlerian therapy.
Hmm.
So while Freud was all about the unconscious and, those hidden desires and childhood experiences, Adler really took a different approach.
Yeah, I think he's definitely, I mean, I love Freud, don't get me wrong,
Yeah.
but I think Adler is definitely a lot more applicable to everyday life. He really focused on what we are consciously aware of and how our social connections really drive us.
So it's like how we relate and connect with each other and with the world around us
Mm.
that shapes who we become, right?
Totally. And I think that's so important for people to hear because, we often feel like we're, victims of our past or, our circumstances. But Adler really emphasizes this idea that we have a lot more control over our lives than we think we do.
Okay, so let's get into some of the core ideas of Adlerian therapy. What are like the must-know concepts for the listener to understand this approach?
All right, so first up, we have the idea that our consciousness is really the center of our personality, not the unconscious. And so Adler really believed that we come into the world with our own unique set of talents and traits.
So we're not just blank slates when we're born.
Exactly, and that's a big difference from Freud, who, believed that our personalities were shaped by these, unconscious drives and conflicts.
Okay, so we're born with our own unique set of stuff. Then what?
Then we develop what Adler called private logic. And I know it sounds kind of technical, but it's basically just like the way that we see the world. It's our own personal set of beliefs and interpretations about ourselves and other people and the world around us.
So our unique lens.
Exactly. And that lens is really shaped by, our early experiences, our family dynamics, our culture, all those things.
Okay, and does that lead to the idea of the subjective final goal?
Yes, exactly. So the subjective final goal is this idea that we all have like an imagined ideal future self. It's like this picture that we have in our minds of who we want to be and what we want to achieve in life.
So it's like this vision that we're always kind of striving towards.
Right. And it's usually based on, our private logic or early experiences. And, it might not even be something that we're consciously aware of,
Yeah.
but it's definitely there driving our behavior.
It's in the background.
Yeah, exactly.
So how does birth order fit into all of this?
Well, Adler believed that our birth order, whether we were the firstborn, the middle child, the youngest or only child, could have a significant impact on our personality and behavior.
Oh, really? Interesting.
Yeah, so for example, firstborns tend to be more responsible and achievement-oriented,
Makes sense.
while youngest children might be more rebellious and attention-seeking.
Yeah, I can see that. I'm a youngest child.
Yeah, and of course these are just generalizations, but I think it's interesting to think about how our birth order might have shaped the way we see the world and how we interact with other people.
I like it.
Yeah.
Okay, and then there's this idea of the drive to move beyond feelings of inferiority. What's that all about?
So Adler believed that as human beings, we all have this innate desire to feel competent and capable and to belong. And so when we feel inferior or inadequate, it motivates us to strive for improvement and to overcome our challenges.
Makes sense. I mean, who wants to feel inferior?
Exactly. And so this drive to overcome inferiority is really what fuels our growth and development throughout our lives.
Okay, so we've got this drive. And then what about the concept of choice and responsibility?
So Adler was a big believer in free will, and he really emphasized the idea that we have the power to choose how we respond to our circumstances.
So we're not just, pawns in the game of life.
Right, exactly. And so even though, our past experiences and our private logic can have a strong influence on us, we ultimately have the responsibility to choose our own path
Yeah.
and to create the life that we want.
I like that.
Yeah.
Okay, so for this deep dive, we've been looking at a bunch of different sources, discussions, role plays and stuff like that really bring these Adlerian ideas to life. And, we're interested in, exploring things like early memories and seeing how these techniques are actually used in practice.
Yeah.
What's our mission here? What do we want the listener to take away from this?
Well, I think our mission is to really help the listener understand how Adlerian therapy can be used to, better understand themselves, their patterns of behavior, their relationships, and ultimately how to create a more fulfilling life.
Okay, so we're going to be sharing some actionable insights that you can use in your own life. Let's start with this technique of exploring early memories.
Yeah, so this is one of my favorite techniques in Adlerian therapy because it's really fascinating to see how our early memories can reveal so much about, our private logic and our subjective final goal.
So it's not about the objective truth of these memories, right?
Mm.
It's more about the meaning that we've assigned to them.
Exactly. And so the process usually involves, recalling around 7 to 10 of your earliest memories and then kind of looking for any recurring themes or patterns.
So if you keep remembering being left out as a kid, that could tell you something.
Right, exactly. And so once we've identified these themes, we can start to explore how they might be playing out in our lives today, in our relationships, our careers, our choices.
It's almost like a blueprint for your life. In
Totally.
one of the videos we watched, this person remembered being really tall as a kid and not wanting a lot of attention.
Yeah, that's a great example because, it could be that this person learned early on that it was safer to kind of blend in and not stand out.
And then as an adult, maybe they're, not going after what they really want, or they're not speaking up for themselves.
Exactly. And so by exploring that early memory, we can start to understand the root of that behavior and then start to challenge it.
And the therapist in that video asked this great question: where did you learn that?
Yeah, I love that question because it really helps people to kind of step back and to see that their beliefs are not necessarily facts.
It's not just how things are,
Yeah.
it's something that you learned.
Right.
Okay, so let's talk about the lifestyle assessment. This seems like a pretty comprehensive process.
It's basically a deep dive into the client's life,
Yeah.
their family history, their cultural background, their values, their strengths, their challenges.
So it's really about understanding the whole person.
Exactly. And it's so important because, you know, no two people are exactly alike.
Of course not.
So we can't just apply a one-size-fits-all approach to therapy.
And you mentioned that it's really important to understand the client's views on their siblings and parents.
Yeah, because our family dynamics play such a huge role in shaping who we are, you
And
know?
those early relationships are so foundational.
Exactly. And so by understanding, how the client perceived their relationships with their siblings and parents, we can start to see how those patterns might be repeating themselves in their adult relationships.
Okay, now let's talk a bit more about birth order. I know you mentioned it earlier, but even though the research has its nuances, it still seems like a useful thing to consider.
Definitely. I think it can be a really helpful tool for self-understanding. And so instead of, making assumptions about someone based on their birth order, I like to ask questions like, how do you think being the oldest, middle, or youngest child has impacted your life and your relationships?
So it's more about prompting self-reflection.
Right. And it's really interesting to hear people's perspectives because, even if there's no scientific evidence to support the idea of birth order, I think most people can relate to it in some way.
It resonates.
Yeah.
Now let's move on to some specific techniques that are used in Adlerian therapy. The miracle question sounds pretty interesting.
Yeah, the miracle question is a classic technique in solution-focused therapy, and it's also used a lot in Adlerian therapy.
What's it all about?
So basically, the therapist asks the client to imagine that they wake up one morning and the problem that they've been struggling with is gone.
Poof.
Gone.
Exactly. And then the therapist asks, what would be different? What would you be doing differently?
Oh, I see.
And so by focusing on what would be different, the client starts to shift their attention away from the problem and towards solutions.
Yeah, it's like that thing where people always say, if I won the lottery, I would, quit my job and travel the world.
Right, but the miracle question is more about what would you be doing differently in your everyday life?
Okay. Yeah, that makes more sense.
Because even if a miracle doesn't happen overnight,
Yeah.
you can still start making those changes today.
It's about taking action.
Exactly.
Okay, and what about the push button technique? What's that all about? So the push button technique is a really cool technique that's designed to help people become more aware of the connection between their thoughts, their emotions, and their physical sensations.
That mind-body connection.
Exactly. And so basically, the therapist guides the client to recall a time when they were feeling really stressed or anxious.
Bring it back up.
Right. And then they ask the client to pay attention to, what they were thinking, what they were feeling emotionally, and what they were feeling physically.
So really tuning in.
And then the therapist guides the client to recall a time when they were feeling really happy and relaxed.
Okay, so switching it up.
And again, they ask the client to pay attention to their thoughts, their emotions, and their physical sensations.
So it's like pushing a button to change your state.
Exactly. And what this technique demonstrates is that we actually have a lot more control over our emotional state than we think we do.
Because we can choose what we focus on.
Exactly.
I like that. And in one of our sources, they mentioned using positive imagery as a way to kind of keep that positive button pushed.
Oh, yeah, that's a great idea. Like putting up pictures of loved ones or beautiful places or inspiring quotes.
Surround yourself with good vibes.
Exactly.
One of the sources even mentioned that this technique could actually help therapists themselves.
Oh, totally. Because, therapists are human too, and we have our own stresses and anxieties.
Yeah, where?
And so by using this technique, before a session or even during a session, if we're feeling a little bit overwhelmed, it can really help us to, regulate our own emotional state and to create a more positive and supportive environment for our clients.
So everybody wins.
Exactly.
Okay, so finally, let's touch on the Adlerian emphasis on social motivation and belonging.
Yeah, so this is a really key concept in Adlerian therapy. Adler believed that our desire to feel connected to others and to feel like we belong is a fundamental human need.
We're social creatures.
Exactly. And so this need for belonging really drives a lot of our behavior.
It's about fitting in and feeling accepted,
Right. And also about feeling like we're contributing to something larger than ourselves.
making a difference.
Yeah.
This seems so different from Freud's focus on, those basic instincts and drives.
Totally. Because Freud really emphasized, those primal urges like sex and aggression.
Right.
But Adler believed that those drives were actually secondary to our social needs.
Oh, interesting.
So, we might act in ways that seem selfish or aggressive, but ultimately it's because we're trying to get our needs for belonging and significance met.
We just want to be loved.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've covered a ton of ground here. Let's bring it all together for the listener. What are the key takeaways from Adlerian therapy?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that we have a lot more control over our lives than we often think we do. Adler believed that we are not simply products of our past or our circumstances.
We have choices.
Exactly. And so by understanding our private logic, our subjective final goal, and our drive to overcome feelings of inferiority, we can start to make more conscious choices that lead to a more fulfilling life.
And these techniques, like the miracle question and the push-button technique, can help us to actually make those changes.
Absolutely. And I think it's also important to remember that we're not alone in this journey.
We need each other.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Adler really emphasized the importance of social connection and belonging.
Community.
Yeah.
This has been a truly fascinating deep dive into Adlerian therapy.
Yeah, I agree.
As we wrap up, here's a little something for you, the listener, to ponder. This week, take some time to think back to one of your earliest memories. What do you remember? What feelings come up for you? And how might those early experiences be shaping your life today? Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.
Thanks for listening.